A Christmas classroom turns cold when a teacher makes a claim that silences every black student. The classroom was decorated for Christmas when the teacher laughed and said it out loud. Black kids don't celebrate Christmas anyway. The room froze, every eye turning toward one black boy sitting in the middle row, his face burning with humiliation. The teacher expected silence, obedience, the usual retreat. Instead, the boy stood up, hands shaking, voice steady, and said something no one was prepared to hear. And in that moment, the lie that had lived for generations began to crack. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The classroom had been dressed to perform joy. Paper snowflakes clung to the windows. A fake pine tree sagged in the corner under the weight of cheap ornaments, and a string of blinking lights hummed faintly above the whiteboard. The smell of dry erase markers mixed with cinnamon-scented air freshener, an artificial attempt at warmth that failed the moment the sentence left the teacher's mouth. What had been an ordinary December morning, students half awake, backpacks slumped against desks, holiday music leaking faintly from another classroom down the hall, suddenly hardened into something rigid and unforgiving. The room did not erupt or gasp. It froze. Silence fell not because no one had something to say, but because everyone understood exactly who had just been spoken about. The teacher stood near the front, arms crossed loosely, tone casual in the way adults often used when they believed their words carried no consequences. She had been talking about holiday traditions, about how Christmas looked different in different homes, smiling as she gestured toward the decorations, as if they were evidence of inclusivity. Then she said it. An offhand claim framed as a matter-of-fact observation rather than an opinion. She suggested that some students in the room, particularly black students, probably did not celebrate Christmas the way most families did, implying absence rather than difference. The sentence was not loud or aggressive. That was what made it worse. It landed softly and stayed there, like a stain spreading through fabric. Every black student in the room felt it at once. It was not a new feeling, but it was no less sharp. A quiet awareness moved through them. An unspoken understanding that they had just been singled out without being named. Their bodies responded before their minds could. Shoulders stiffened, eyes lowered, hands tightened around pencils. They had learned early that attention could be dangerous. The safest response was stillness. Around them, other students shifted uncomfortably, some confused, some pretending not to notice, some glancing sideways with curiosity that felt invasive rather than innocent. Near the center of the room sat a black boy, who had mastered the art of being unremarkable. His desk was always clean, his homework always turned in, his voice rarely heard. He had learned that invisibility could be protection, but now that shield was gone. He felt the attention before he saw it, a pressure in his chest that made breathing feel deliberate. When he finally looked up, he saw it confirmed in real time, eyes drifting toward him, then toward the other black students, then back to the teacher, as if waiting for validation. The boy's name had not been spoken, but he felt called forward all the same, as though the statement had been written across his forehead. The teacher continued speaking, unaware or unconcerned with the shift she had caused. She talked about how classrooms had to be mindful of different backgrounds, her tone dipping into something that sounded almost charitable. The words were wrapped in the language of tolerance, but underneath was an assumption that black families were defined by what they lacked. The boy felt heat rise in his face, not from embarrassment alone, but from the familiar anger that came with being reduced to a stereotype. He thought of his home, of the way December unfolded there every year, of traditions built carefully despite limited money and constant judgment. None of it matched what had just been implied. He glanced down at his desk, focusing on a small crack in the laminate surface, trying to anchor himself. He had promised himself he would not react. Reacting always made things worse. Teachers became defensive. Classmates whispered. Administrators used words like misunderstanding. He had seen it happen before. Not always to himself, but often enough to know the pattern. Silence, he told himself, was easier. Silence was safer. But the room refused to move on. The teacher's gaze drifted again, lingering just a second too long on the cluster of black students, as if waiting for confirmation of her assumption. Around the room, subtle changes took place. A white student near the back smirked, nudging his friend. Another looked genuinely uncomfortable, staring at the decorations, as if they might suddenly become interesting. A girl near the window frowned, her confusion turning into something closer to doubt. The boy noticed all of it. Moments like this sharpened his awareness, trained him to read the room like a map of threats and exits. He felt both exposed and erased at the same time, seen as a symbol, not as a person. The teacher finally paused, sensing the tension but misreading its cause. She cleared her throat, her expression tightening slightly, and tried to reframe her point. Instead of retracting what she had said, she leaned into it, explaining that not everyone shared the same cultural priorities, that some families focused on survival, rather than celebration. Her words were careful now, polished, but they carried the same message. The boy felt something inside him shift, a small crack forming where resignation used to live. It was one thing to be misunderstood, it was another to be defined publicly, incorrectly, and with authority. He thought about how the lesson would echo beyond this room, how students would repeat it later, reshaped into jokes or assumptions, how it would settle quietly into the way people looked at him, spoke to him, expected less from him. The weight of it pressed down, heavier than the backpack at his feet. He realized that staying quiet did not erase the damage, it only confirmed it. Still, he did not move. Not yet. His hands remained folded, his eyes forward, his posture controlled with practiced discipline. The teacher glanced at the clock, then back at the class, as if deciding whether to move on or clarify further. Her voice took on a firmer edge. She insisted she was simply acknowledging reality, that pretending everyone shared the same experiences was naive. The room seemed to shrink as she spoke, the decorations suddenly mocking in their cheer. The boy felt the finality in her tone, the way adults sometimes close doors without realizing anyone was sanding them. What unsettled him most was not the comment itself, but the confidence with which it was delivered. There was no hesitation, no awareness that she might be wrong. In that moment, he understood that the assumption was not accidental. It was learned, reinforced, and now passed down in a classroom, decorated for a holiday she believed did not belong to him. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until it felt like a test, one he was expected to fail by doing nothing. The teacher straightened, preparing to continue the lesson as if nothing had happened, as if the room had not shifted on its axis. She offered a small, tight smile, and added one final line, meant to settle the issue, to justify herself before anyone could challenge her. She repeated the idea more plainly this time, stating that Black families generally did not celebrate Christmas in the traditional sense, and that it was important for others to understand that difference. Instead of apologizing, instead of questioning herself, she doubled down, locking the assumption in place, and daring the room to dispute it. The Black boy who learned early that staying quiet was the only way to survive school. The silence that followed the teacher's words did not feel new to him. It felt familiar, like a muscle memory his body returned to without permission. As he sat there staring straight ahead, his mind drifted backward, not by choice but by instinct, to all the moments that had trained him for this exact second. He had learned early that school was not just a place of lessons and grades, but a place where survival required restraint. His earliest memories of classrooms were not of numbers or letters, but of rules that were never written down. Speak softly. Don't correct adults. Don't make them uncomfortable. And most of all, never give them a reason to see you as difficult. Growing up, he had been praised for being well-behaved, a compliment that always came with an unspoken comparison. Teachers admired how quiet he was, how he never talked back, how he blended into the background. What they never saw was the effort it took to maintain that image. Silence was not natural to him. It was practiced. It was learned through moments when curiosity was mistaken for defiance, when questions were interpreted as challenges, when emotions were labeled as attitude. Over time, he understood that his safety depended on how little of himself he revealed. Christmas seasons at school had always been complicated. Every December, classrooms transformed into curated versions of joy that assumed a single narrative. There were stories about perfect mornings, gifts stacked under trees, parents with time and money and ease. Teachers spoke nostalgically, projecting their own experiences outward, as if they were universal truths. He learned to nod along, even when the stories did not match his life. He learned to smile politely when classmates compared gifts, to deflect questions about what he got for Christmas, to shrink his reality down into something that would not invite scrutiny. At home, Christmas existed, but not in the glossy way school seemed to expect. It was quieter, intentional, built around presence rather than excess. His family celebrated with what they had, not what they were supposed to have. Faith, tradition, and love shaped their holidays more than money ever could. But he learned quickly that explaining this required energy and risk. People heard what they wanted to hear. They filtered his words through their assumptions, turning nuance into confirmation of stereotype. So he stopped explaining. It was easier to let them believe he lacked something than to fight for the truth. The boy's mother had taught him resilience, without ever naming it as such. She reminded him that the world would often misunderstand him before it ever tried to know him. Her advice was careful, shaped by her own experiences navigating systems that rarely offered grace. She encouraged him to focus on his work, to stay composed, to choose battles wisely. There was love in her caution, but also exhaustion. She knew what happened to black boys, who were perceived as disruptive, outspoken, or emotional. Silence, she believed, could buy him time. Over the years, the lessons stacked up. He watched white classmates challenge teachers without consequence, express frustration without punishment, make jokes that would have earned him detention. Each incident reinforced what he already suspected. The rules were not the same for everyone. So he adapted. He lowered his voice, moderated his expressions, learned how to disappear in plain sight. Teachers mistook his restraint for agreement. Classmates mistook it for weakness. Administrators mistook it for success. Sitting in the Christmas-decorated classroom now, those memories collided with the present. The teacher's assumption did not surprise him. What surprised him was how publicly it was stated. Usually bias hid behind coded language, behind jokes or lowered voices. This time it stood at the front of the room, confident and unchallenged. He felt the old instinct rise to stay still, to let it pass, to protect himself by becoming invisible. His body followed the script automatically, but his mind hesitated. He thought about how many times silence had cost him pieces of himself. How many moments he had swallowed words that mattered. How often he had allowed others to define his reality, because correcting them felt too risky. He wondered when endurance turned into erasure, when survival demanded something more than quiet compliance. The question unsettled him because it did not have a clear answer. The room remained tense, the teacher's presence looming, her authority unquestioned. He noticed how easily her words had shaped the atmosphere, how quickly a single sentence had altered how he was seen. He realized that silence, in this moment, did not feel neutral. It felt like permission. Permission for the assumption to stand. Permission for the narrative to continue. Permission for his classmates to carry this belief forward, unchecked. A flicker of anger surfaced, not explosive, but focused. It was the kind of anger that came from being understood wrongly, for too long. He felt it tighten in his chest, steady, rather than wild. For the first time he wondered what would happen if he broke the pattern. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to disrupt the comfort of the lie. The thought scared him more than the teacher's words had. Silence had always been predictable. Speaking introduced variables he could not control. He glanced around the room again, noticing the black students who remained motionless, their faces carefully blank. He recognized himself in them, saw the same calculations happening behind their eyes. None of them had agreed with the teacher, but none of them had challenged her either. He wondered if they were waiting for someone else to move first, or if they had already accepted that this was how things worked. The realization pressed on him. If no one spoke, this moment would harden into memory, into fact. The teacher shuffled papers on her desk, preparing to move on, to close the door she had opened without realizing it. The boy felt time narrowing, the opportunity slipping away. His heart pounded, not with fear of punishment, but with the weight of responsibility he never asked for. He did not want to represent anyone. He just wanted to exist honestly. Yet here he was, positioned by circumstance, expected to either confirm a stereotype or quietly endure it. For the first time, silence did not feel safe. It felt dangerous, like something he might not recover from if he let it happen again. When assumptions become lessons, and bias is taught as fact, the teacher did not move on. Instead, she leaned into the moment, as if it were an opportunity, mistaking discomfort for engagement. Her voice took on the practiced rhythm of instruction, smoothing the edges of what she had already said, and shaping it into something that sounded educational. She began reframing her assumption as context, explaining that understanding different communities was part of becoming informed citizens. The language was careful, almost polished, but the meaning underneath remained unchanged. What had started as a comment was now evolving into a lesson, and the boy felt the shift immediately. Bias, once spoken, had found structure. She gestured toward the board and began outlining examples, speaking broadly about socioeconomic differences and cultural priorities. Each phrase stacked neatly on the last, creating a narrative that positioned some families as normative and others as deviations. The boy listened as she described Christmas not as a religious or personal observance, but as a benchmark for belonging. Her words suggested that those who did not fit the imagined mold were somehow outside the center of American life. The authority of her role transformed speculation into something that sounded like fact, and he understood how easily misinformation could pass as truth when delivered with confidence. Around him, the room adjusted. Students straightened in their seats, pens poised, absorbing the lesson as they had been trained to do. No one raised a hand to question the framing. No one asked whose perspective was being centered. The boy watched comprehension settle across faces, not as understanding but as acceptance. He realized that what frightened him most was not the teacher's bias, but how quickly it was being normalized. This was how ideas hardened, quietly, efficiently, without resistance. A student near the front nodded along, murmuring agreement. When the teacher paused for emphasis, another scribbled notes, underlining phrases that would later appear on a test. The boy felt something twist in his chest, as he imagined those notes being reviewed at home, repeated at dinner tables, carried into other classrooms. The assumption was no longer confined to this room. It was being packaged for distribution. He wondered how many times misinformation had entered his life this way, unnoticed, unchecked, disguised as learning. The teacher continued, offering anecdotes that were clearly not her own. She spoke about communities she had read about traditions that were less common, her tone implying distance rather than curiosity. Each example erased complexity, flattening lived experiences into convenient generalizations. The boy recognized the pattern. This was not about understanding difference. It was about defining it from the outside. The power imbalance was subtle but absolute. She spoke. They listened. The lesson became reality. He glanced at the other black students again, noticing how their expressions had shifted. Some stared straight ahead, faces carefully neutral. Others looked down, disengaging as a form of self-preservation. None of them appeared surprised, but all of them looked tired. He wondered how many times they had sat through lessons that explained them without including them. How often their identities had been discussed as abstractions rather than lived truths. The realization settled heavily. This moment was not an exception. It was part of a pattern larger than this classroom. An unexpected twist emerged when the teacher invited participation, not to question her premise but to reinforce it. She asked the class to share examples of how different families might celebrate, or not celebrate, the holidays. The room stirred. A few hands went up, hesitant at first, then more confidently. One student offered a vague comment about some people not really doing Christmas. Another mentioned that not everyone had decorations or gifts. Each contribution, though not explicitly malicious, added another layer to the narrative the teacher had constructed. The boy listened as his classmates built on her assumption, unaware that they were doing harm. He felt his throat tighten when a student turned slightly in his seat, glancing back at him before speaking, as if seeking confirmation. The boy looked away, his jaw set. That single glance carried more weight than the words that followed. It was proof that the lesson had already begun to reshape how he was seen. He was no longer just a classmate. He was a reference point, an example. The hierarchy solidified quietly, with him placed firmly on the margin. The teacher smiled, pleased with the discussion, and affirmed the responses. Her approval acted like a seal, validating the ideas being shared. The boy felt a surge of frustration, not explosive, but sharp and focused. He realized that even if the teacher believed she was fostering inclusion, the effect was the opposite. By speaking about black families without inviting black voices, she had turned them into subjects rather than participants. The curriculum had absorbed prejudice and presented it as understanding. As the conversation continued, he noticed how the atmosphere shifted. Some students grew more confident in their observations, their language becoming bolder. Others withdrew, sensing the tension but unsure how to name it. The boy felt caught between two instincts, the urge to protect himself by remaining quiet, and the growing awareness that silence was allowing the lesson to metastasize. Each minute that passed felt like a door closing, locking in a version of reality that did not include him. He thought about how this lesson would echo beyond today, how it would influence group projects, casual jokes, expectations, how teachers in other classes might unconsciously reinforce the same ideas. The damage was not immediate or dramatic. It was cumulative. It settled into perceptions, shaped interactions, justified exclusion. He understood now that the harm extended far beyond his own feelings. It was shaping how others would see blackness itself. The teacher finally began to wrap up the discussion, summarizing the key points as if they were neutral observations rather than loaded assumptions. She wrote a phrase on the board that distilled the entire conversation into a single line, something that would be easy to remember, easy to repeat. The boy felt a chill as he read it, recognizing how effortlessly bias had been transformed into a takeaway. As the bell loomed closer, signaling the end of the period, he realized with a sinking clarity that the damage was no longer contained within him. It was spreading through notes, through nods, through the authority of a lesson taught as fact. And if no one interrupted it, it would leave this room unchanged, carrying the lie with it. A single raised hand that disrupts the comfort of power. The room was settling into its conclusion, the teacher's summary hanging in the air like a final stamp of approval, when something small but irreversible happened. The boy felt it before he decided it, a tightening in his spine, a quiet refusal forming beneath the practiced stillness he had worn for years. His hand moved almost on its own, lifting slowly from the desk, fingers steady despite the rush of blood in his ears. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but in a room conditioned to accept authority without interruption, it was seismic. For a moment, no one noticed. The teacher continued speaking, her back half turned as she finished writing on the board. The boy's arm remained raised, suspended in a space that suddenly felt exposed. He was acutely aware of how visible he had made himself, how this single gesture broke the contract he had spent years honoring. Silence was no longer an option. He had already violated it. He wondered briefly if he should lower his hand, retreat back into safety before anyone acknowledged what he had done. But the moment passed, and his arm stayed up. When the teacher finally turned, her eyes scanned the room out of habit, expecting compliance. They landed on his raised hand, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Surprise flickered first, then something closer to annoyance. The boy noticed it immediately. He had learned to read these micro-expressions the way others read traffic signs. This was not curiosity. This was disruption. He had interrupted the smooth flow of a lesson she believed was complete. The room reacted in waves. A few students straightened, alerted by the change in energy. Others glanced from the boy to the teacher, sensing that something unscripted was about to happen. The black students in the room froze, their attention sharpening. They understood the risk before anyone else did. A raised hand from him did not mean the same thing it meant from others. It carried history. It carried consequence. The teacher hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Calling on him meant opening the door she had just tried to close. Ignoring him risked exposing the imbalance she likely did not want to acknowledge. The pause stretched, long enough for discomfort to spread. The boy's arm began to ache, but he did not lower it. Each second felt like a test of endurance, not physical but emotional. He was no longer just responding to a comment, he was challenging a structure. "Do you have something to add?" the teacher finally asked, her tone controlled but edged, as if bracing for inconvenience rather than dialogue. The boy swallowed. His heart hammered against his ribs, loud enough that he was sure others could hear it. He had not rehearsed this moment. He had not planned a speech. All he knew was that allowing the assumption to stand felt worse than whatever might come next. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the same precision he used to navigate every other space that was not built for him. "I think it might be more complicated than that," he said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. The simplicity of the statement seemed to catch the teacher off guard. It was not confrontational. It did not accuse. It merely suggested nuance, something the lesson had conspicuously lacked. A murmur moved through the room, quiet but noticeable. The boy continued, feeling the weight of every eye on him, the responsibility pressing harder now that he had begun. "My family celebrates Christmas," he added, the words landing softly but firmly. "We just don't all do it the same way." The teacher's lips pressed together, her posture stiffening. She responded quickly, too quickly, as if eager to regain control. "Of course," she said, her smile tight, "but we're talking about general trends, not individual exceptions." The word exception struck him like a slap. It reduced his lived experience to an anomaly, something to be acknowledged briefly, and then dismissed. He felt a flicker of anger rise, sharper this time, but he kept his voice measured. "I don't think it's an exception if a lot of people just aren't being asked," he replied. The room went quiet again. But this silence was different. It was alert. Students leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift. The boy realized that he had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer clarifying. He was contradicting. The teacher's authority, once unchallenged, now faced resistance from someone she likely did not expect. She inhaled, her irritation becoming more visible. "We don't have time to debate this right now," she said, her voice firm. "The point is to recognize differences, but recognizing differences isn't the same as making assumptions," the boy said, surprising even himself with the steadiness of his response. He could feel the room holding its breath. He could feel the years of silence behind him, pushing him forward now that he had finally moved. An unexpected twist rippled through the class when a student near the window spoke up, not in support but in confusion. "I thought Christmas was about church and family," she said, glancing between the boy and the teacher. "Why would that be different?" The question hung there, innocent but destabilizing. It exposed the cracks in the lesson, the places where generalizations could not hold up under simple scrutiny. The teacher's irritation sharpened, her control slipping just enough to reveal frustration beneath professionalism. She shot the boy a look that made it clear she associated this disruption with him. "This isn't about theology," the teacher snapped lightly, then caught herself. She straightened, smoothing her tone. "Let's stay focused." But focus was no longer possible. The energy in the room had shifted irreversibly. The boy felt it in the way students watched him now. Not all with judgment. Some with curiosity. A few with something like respect. He also felt the risk intensify. Speaking again could escalate things quickly. Staying quiet now would make his initial resistance meaningless. He hesitated, measuring the cost of another sentence. He thought about his mother's warnings, about the careful balance she had taught him to maintain. He thought about the other black students in the room, still silent, still watching. He realized that whether he spoke again or not, something had already changed. The assumption had been interrupted. The comfort of power had been disturbed. The teacher's patience finally thinned. She folded her arms, her expression openly irritated now, and fixed her gaze on him. The room felt smaller, the decorations suddenly irrelevant, the holiday cheer drained of warmth. "If you have something specific to say," she said sharply, "now would be the time." She called on him again, this time not out of politeness, but challenge her irritation, unmistakable as the entire class turned to see what he would do next. The weight of speaking while representing an entire race. The moment the teacher finished speaking, the room seemed to tilt toward him. It was not dramatic or sudden, but unmistakable, the collective attention locking in place, narrowing until he felt like the only solid object left. His name had not been said, but everyone knew who the question belonged to. The teacher's irritation lingered in the air, sharp and expectant, and beneath it sat something heavier, the assumption that whatever came next would either validate her authority or disrupt it further. The boy felt the weight of that expectation settle on his shoulders, heavier than any backpack he had ever carried. He stood slowly, aware that even this movement was being interpreted. Every second felt elongated, as if time itself had slowed to watch him choose his next step. His heart pounded, not from fear alone, but from the impossible position he had been placed in. He was not just speaking for himself anymore. He could feel it in the way the room watched him, in the way the teacher's gaze sharpened, in the way even the decorations seemed to fade into the background. He had become a stand-in, a representative, a test case for something much larger than a classroom discussion. The boy knew this role well, even if he had never asked for it. Black children learned early that individuality was a luxury. One mistake could be magnified into a stereotype. One sentence could be twisted into confirmation. He thought about how carefully he had always chosen his words, how often he had edited himself mid-thought to avoid sounding angry, emotional, or defensive. Now, standing in front of the class, he realized that restraint alone would not save him. Silence had already failed, but speaking carried its own risks. He glanced briefly at the other black students, catching flashes of recognition in their eyes. They were not encouraging him, not discouraging him either. They were watching, calculating, hoping perhaps that he would say what they could not, fearing that the cost would be too high. He felt a surge of responsibility that made his chest tighten. This was not just about Christmas anymore. It was about dignity, about being seen as complete rather than conditional. The teacher cleared her throat, impatience edging into her voice. "Well?" she said, her tone making it clear she expected an answer that fit neatly within the boundaries she had set. The boy inhaled deeply, grounding himself. He did not rush. He understood that how he spoke mattered almost as much as what he said. "I don't think it's fair to talk about black families like we're all the same," he began, his voice steady but layered with emotion. He did not try to hide. "When you say things like that, people stop seeing us as individuals." A subtle shift rippled through the room. Some students leaned back, uncomfortable. Others leaned in, curious. The teacher's expression tightened again, but she did not interrupt. That silence, hers this time, felt charged. He continued, choosing honesty over caution. My family celebrates Christmas, he said, not loudly, but clearly. We go to church. We cook together. We give what we can. Just because it doesn't look like what's on TV doesn't mean it's not real. The word real landed harder than he expected. He saw it register on a few faces, saw confusion turn into something closer to reflection. He also saw resistance, especially from the teacher, whose posture had stiffened. She crossed her arms, a defensive reflex that did not go unnoticed. Authority did not like being challenged, especially by someone it had already categorized. You're missing the point, she said, her voice measured but clipped. We're discussing patterns, not personal stories. The boy felt the familiar frustration rise again, but this time he did not suppress it. That's the problem, he replied, his tone respectful but firm. When you turn people into patterns, you stop listening to what they're actually saying. A murmur moved through the class, louder now. A student whispered something to the person next to them. Another frowned, clearly rethinking the lesson they had just accepted. The boy noticed it all. Even as his focus narrowed, he realized something important in that moment. The teacher no longer controlled the narrative completely. The room was thinking, questioning, and that scared her. An unexpected twist came when the teacher tried to regain footing by appealing to neutrality. Education requires objectivity, she said. We can't let feelings override facts. The boy nodded slowly, surprising her. I agree, he said, but facts should come from people who live them, not assumptions about them. That sentence landed differently. It was not accusatory. It was logical. And logic was harder to dismiss without revealing bias. The teacher opened her mouth to respond, then hesitated, as if realizing that any immediate rebuttal might expose more than she intended. The boy felt the room change again. Not dramatically, but undeniably, the air felt thicker, more attentive. Students were no longer passive recipients of information. They were witnesses. He sensed that something had shifted beyond his control now. He was no longer just defending his family. He was challenging how knowledge itself was being framed. He took another breath, feeling the weight of what came next. He knew that continuing would deepen the divide. He also knew that stopping now would leave the most important part unsaid. His voice softened, but his words sharpened. When teachers say things like that, he said, people believe it. They repeat it. And then we're the ones who have to carry it. The teacher's irritation flared openly this time. That's enough, she said, though her voice wavered just slightly. We're not turning this into what? The boy asked quietly, not interrupting, but finishing the thought she had left hanging. A conversation. The room went completely still. Even the blinking lights above the board seemed to pause. The boy felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that came when fear gave way to clarity. He realized that whatever happened next, he had already crossed a point of no return. The lesson would not end the way it was supposed to. He looked around the room one last time, seeing it with new eyes. This was not just a classroom anymore. It was a space where something honest was finally being spoken aloud. He felt the pressure of representation still heavy on him, but now it was balanced by something else. A sense that truth once voiced could not be easily put back. He opened his mouth to continue, to say what he had never planned to say, and as he did, the room changed in a way none of them expected. Christmas through the eyes of a family America never sees. He did not raise his voice when he continued. He did not need to. The room was already leaning toward him, drawn in by the shift that had taken place the moment he chose honesty over safety. His words slowed, becoming deliberate, as if he understood that this part mattered most, not just as a response but as a record. He spoke not like a student answering a question, but like someone finally allowed to describe a world that had always existed just outside the frame others used to see him. When people talk about Christmas like it belongs to only one kind of family, he said, they forget how many ways joy survives. His gaze drifted briefly, not to escape, but to remember. He described mornings that did not begin with piles of gifts, but with the smell of food cooking early because his mother believed celebrations started with effort. He spoke of his grandmother's quiet rituals, of faith that did not depend on decoration, of prayer said not out of obligation but gratitude. The room grew still, not out of discomfort this time, but attention. He explained how his family measured Christmas differently, not by what could be bought, but by what could be held together. How some years meant hand-me-down ornaments pulled carefully from boxes that had outlasted jobs and apartments. How lights were reused until they barely worked, and how that never mattered because the point was never display. His voice carried a steadiness that surprised even him, shaped by years of watching others miss our tan without ever asking. The boy spoke about sacrifice without dramatizing it. He did not frame his family as tragic or lacking. Instead, he described intention, the way his mother planned months ahead, the way she shielded them from stress by turning preparation into tradition. He spoke of church services that felt like community rather than obligation, of songs sung not because they were seasonal, but because they were inherited. Each sentence dismantled a stereotype without naming it, offering reality as quiet resistance. Around him, students shifted in their seats, some visibly rethinking what they had assumed. A few looked down, embarrassed by the ease with which they had accepted a simplified version of someone else's life. Others watched him closely, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The decorations no longer felt performative. They felt ironic, unable to capture the depth of what was being shared. Christmas, in his telling, was not a spectacle. It was endurance made meaningful. He spoke about joy that did not ask permission to exist, about laughter that came after long weeks, about meals that tasted better because they were shared. He acknowledged struggle without letting it define the story. "We don't celebrate less," he said quietly. "We just celebrate differently." The simplicity of the statement cut through the room, challenging the hierarchy the lesson had implied. The teacher shifted uncomfortably, though she remained silent. Her authority felt smaller now, not because it had been attacked, but because it had been exposed as incomplete. The boy continued, sensing the importance of momentum. He talked about how assumptions erased nuance, how people decided who belonged before ever listening. He did not accuse, he explained. And explanation, in that space, felt more powerful than confrontation. An unexpected emotional turn came when he mentioned the years he had learned to keep these stories to himself. "I didn't think anyone wanted to hear this," he admitted, his voice softening just enough to reveal vulnerability. "So I didn't say anything." The admission hung in the air, heavy with implication. Silence, the room realized, had never meant absence of experience. It had meant absence of invitation. The teacher finally moved, stepping slightly forward as if to reclaim the space. The boy noticed it but did not stop. He spoke now about how racism often worked quietly, not through insults but through assumptions repeated until they felt true. How being unseen was sometimes more damaging than being targeted. His words carried no bitterness, only clarity, and that clarity unsettled the structure the teacher relied on. A student near the back wiped at their eyes, startled by their own reaction. Another nodded slowly, processing. The boy felt the shift ripple outward, a subtle but undeniable change in how the room breathed. He realized that his story was doing something the lesson never had. It was humanizing what had been flattened. Just as he began to speak about what it meant to carry pride quietly, to celebrate without needing validation, the teacher interrupted him. Her voice cut in sharper than intended, urgency overriding restraint. "That's enough," she said, stepping fully back into authority. "We're moving off topic." The interruption landed mid-thought, mid-truth, and the room felt it. The sudden attempt to contain something that had grown too real to manage. The boy stopped speaking, not because he had finished but because he had been cut off. And in that moment, everyone understood that the most important part of his story had yet to be told. Authority feels threatened when truth refuses to stay quiet. The interruption did not end the moment. It exposed it. The teacher's voice, clipped and urgent, landed with the unmistakable sound of control being reclaimed rather than guidance being offered. She stepped forward, aligning herself squarely between the boy and the rest of the room, her posture straightening as if physical presence alone could restore order. "We're moving on," she repeated, louder this time, eyes scanning the desks for compliance. The words carried the authority of policy and position, but beneath them ran a current of discomfort she could not fully hide. The room reacted unevenly. Some students immediately looked down, instinctively retreating to the safety of obedience. Others hesitated, their attention caught between the teacher's command and the boy who had just complicated everything they thought they understood. The fracture was subtle but unmistakable, belief splitting from disbelief, acceptance from doubt. The decorations above the board flickered softly, indifferent to the shift, their cheer now feeling out of place, almost mocking. The boy remained standing. Not defiantly, not dramatically, simply unmoved. He felt the teacher's interruption settle over him, like a lid being forced shut. For years that lid had worked. It had kept things contained, manageable, quiet. But now it felt brittle. He realized with a strange clarity that the interruption was not about time or relevance. It was about fear. Fear of losing the narrative. Fear of acknowledging that the lesson had failed. "We don't need personal stories right now," the teacher said, her tone smoothing, as she tried to reframe the shutdown as professionalism. "This is a classroom discussion, not a—" She paused, searching for a word that would not reveal too much. The boy felt the weight of that dismissal press against his chest. Personal stories, he understood, were inconvenient because they resisted generalization. They did not fit neatly into outlines or objectives. They demanded recognition. He glanced around again, noticing how some students were no longer taking notes. Pens hovered, forgotten. Eyes were fixed, not on the board, but on the space between him and the teacher, where something unresolved lingered. A student near the front raised her eyebrows slightly, confusion giving way to concern. Another shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing for the first time that education could harm as easily as it could help. The boy sensed their uncertainty, and felt a surge of responsibility sharpen into resolve. If he sat down now, the interruption would stand as the final word. The message would be clear. Truth was acceptable only until it disrupted comfort. The teacher turned back toward the board, beginning to erase the phrase she had written earlier, her movements quick and deliberate. The sound of the eraser scraping across the surface felt louder than it should have been, as if she were trying to wipe away more than chalk. "We'll continue with the assignment," she said, her back still turned. "Please open your textbooks." That was when the unexpected twist surfaced. Not from the boy, but from the room itself. "But isn't this part of it?" a student asked quietly. The question was not confrontational. It was earnest. It cut through the tension with the simple logic the lesson had failed to address. The teacher froze for a fraction of a second before turning around again, her expression tightening. "No," she said, too quickly. "It's not." The boy felt something settle inside him. Then, a calm that replaced the earlier fear. He understood now that the teacher's discomfort was not his responsibility. He had been taught to prioritize it for too long. He looked at her, meeting her gaze steadily, and spoke again, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly enough that no one could pretend not to hear. "It is part of it," he said. The room seemed to inhale, as one. The teacher's eyes widened slightly, irritation flaring openly now. "I told you to sit down," she said, the professionalism slipping just enough to reveal authority under threat. The boy did not move. "You asked us to understand differences," he replied. "I'm trying to help people understand." The teacher's jaw tightened. She glanced toward the door briefly, a reflexive check, as if considering escalation. The boy noticed and felt a flicker of something like sadness. He had not wanted this to become a standoff. He had wanted dialogue, but authority, when challenged, often mistook clarity for defiance. Students shifted again, the fracture widening. Some watched the teacher, waiting for consequences. Others watched the boy, waiting to see if truth would be allowed to finish its sentence. The classroom no longer felt like a neutral space. It felt like a threshold. "This is not appropriate," the teacher said, her voice strained. "We're moving on." The boy's voice softened, but it did not recede. "It's not inappropriate to explain your life when someone says it doesn't exist," he said. The words hung there, undeniable. The teacher's authority, once unquestioned, now felt brittle, propped up by procedure rather than respect. She took a step closer to him, lowering her voice as if proximity alone could reassert control. "Sit down," she repeated. "Now." The boy looked around the room one more time. He saw the tension etched into faces, the unasked questions, the realization dawning that education was not always neutral. He understood that this moment would linger long after the bell rang. He also understood that stopping now would teach a lesson he could not accept. He took a breath, steadying himself, and spoke again, refusing to let truth retreat back into silence. A speech that was never planned but always needed. The boy's refusal to sit did not feel like rebellion to him. It felt like alignment, his body finally matching what his mind had been holding back for years. The teacher stood rigid in front of him, authority braced against a truth she could no longer redirect. And for a moment the room seemed suspended between two versions of itself, one where this became another lesson quietly buried, and another where something irreversible was allowed to surface. The boy chose the latter, not because he felt brave, but because retreat suddenly felt like erasure. "I wasn't trying to argue," he said, his voice steady but layered, carrying the weight of everything he had not said before. I was trying to explain what gets lost when people talk about us without us. The word us lingered, expanding beyond him, beyond the black students in the room, reaching toward histories no textbook had ever centered. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, not from fear but from release. Once started, the truth had momentum. He spoke about dignity first, not as an abstract idea, but as something practiced daily in households that were often reduced to statistics. He explained how dignity looked like his mother waking before sunrise to make a holiday meal after working double shifts, refusing to let exhaustion erase celebration. How dignity meant his family dressing carefully for church, not to impress anyone, but to honor themselves. His words were not polished, but they were precise, cutting through myths with lived detail. The classroom listened in a way it hadn't before. This was no longer a student speaking for approval. This was someone narrating a reality that had never been given space. He addressed poverty without apology, naming how it had been misused as a defining feature rather than a condition imposed. People think not having money means not having tradition, he said. But we had traditions before we ever had anything extra. The sentence landed heavily, forcing listeners to confront how easily they had equated wealth with worth. He spoke of generational resilience, not as a buzzword, but as inheritance, of grandparents who celebrated quietly because survival demanded humility, of parents who learned to create joy in constrained spaces, because joy was resistance. He explained how Christmas, for his family, was not about proving belonging to America, but about holding on to themselves within it. Each word dismantled another assumption, not aggressively, but completely. The teacher tried to interject again, but her voice faltered this time, drowned out not by volume, but by attention. The room was no longer hers. Students leaned forward, eyes fixed, not out of spectacle, but recognition. Some saw their own families reflected in pieces of his story. Others saw gaps in their understanding widening into questions they had never considered asking. An unexpected shift occurred when the boy acknowledged his own silence. I didn't think my story mattered here, he admitted. I thought school was a place where we learned about other people, not where we were allowed to be ourselves. The vulnerability in that admission stripped away any remaining defensiveness in the room. This was no longer about Christmas. It was about who education was built for, and who it asked to disappear. He spoke of faith without sermonizing, explaining how belief had sustained his family through years that never made it into holiday cards. How prayer had been as routine as dinner, not dramatic, just necessary. He described joy that survived without permission, laughter that filled small spaces, music that played even when the future felt uncertain. None of it fit the narrow picture that had been presented earlier, and that was the point. The teacher stood frozen now, professionalism cracking under the weight of what she could not control. The boy noticed her discomfort, but did not soften his truth to accommodate it. He was not attacking her. He was exposing a system that rewarded assumptions and punished nuance. When people say we don't celebrate, he said quietly, they're really saying they never looked close enough to see how we do. The room felt transformed, heavy with realization. A student near the aisle stared at the floor, jaw tight, as if replaying past assumptions in real time. Another blinked rapidly, trying to study emotions that had arrived uninvited. The boy felt the shift ripple outward, an emotional current that no authority could easily contain. He finished without flourish, his final words simple and unguarded. We don't need to be explained, he said. We need to be listened to. The silence that followed was not oppressive. It was reverent, thick with the understanding that something important had just been said. Then, quietly, unmistakably, someone in the room began to cry. When classmates realized they were taught to look away, the crying did not interrupt the silence. It deepened it. The sound was soft at first, almost accidental, as if the person had not intended to reveal themselves. But once it began, it became impossible to ignore. Heads turned slowly, not in judgment, but in startled recognition. The boy followed the sound, and saw a classmate near the window. Her face flushed, one hand pressed against her mouth, as if trying to contain something that had already escaped. Her eyes were wet, unfocused, fixed not on him, but somewhere inward, where understanding had arrived too late to remain comfortable. The room shifted again. But this time the change did not center on the teacher. It moved through the students, desk by desk, expression by expression. The boy watched it happen. The subtle recalibration of awareness. Laughter that had once come easily now felt heavy, in memory. Silence that had once felt neutral, now revealed its cost. Students began to recognize themselves, not as passive observers, but as participants who had benefited from looking away. A boy near the back exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together as if trying to scrub something off. He muttered, barely audible, "I didn't think about it like that." The words were not addressed to anyone in particular, but they landed anyway. Another student stared at the notes she had taken earlier, the phrases now reading differently, stripped of their assumed objectivity. The lesson had not just been wrong, it had been easy to accept because it demanded nothing from those it did not harm. The boy felt a complicated mix of emotions watching this unfold. There was no satisfaction in being proven right, no relief in seeing discomfort spread. Instead, there was a quiet ache, the weight of knowing how long it had taken for the room to reach this moment. He understood that awareness did not erase impact. But it mattered. It mattered because once seen, the lie could not be unseen. A student who had laughed earlier quietly, carelessly, shifted in his seat, his confidence evaporating. He glanced toward the boy, then away, shame flickering across his face. The boy did not meet his gaze. This was not about apology or redemption. It was about reckoning, about realizing how comfort had acted as a shield, protecting some while others absorbed the cost. The teacher remained standing, but her presence no longer anchored the room. She looked smaller now, not physically but symbolically. Authority had slipped, not because she had been shouted down, but because her narrative had failed to hold. She cleared her throat, attempting to restore order, but the sound felt inadequate against the emotional weight settling in. "This discussion has gone far enough," she said, her voice tight. "We need to regain focus." But focus had already been redefined. The students were no longer looking at the board. They were looking at each other, really looking for the first time. The boy sensed that some of them were seeing patterns beyond this moment, connecting dots that stretched backward into other classrooms, other comments, other quiet injustices they had ignored because they were inconvenient to challenge. An unexpected moment came when the crying student finally spoke, her voice shaking. I thought not celebrating meant not caring," she said. "I didn't know it could look like that." Her words were clumsy, imperfect, but honest. They cracked something open that had been sealed shut. The teacher stiffened. "This is not appropriate," she repeated. But the phrase had lost its power. The room no longer accepted her framing without question. The boy noticed how her eyes darted toward the door again, calculation replacing confidence. Control was slipping, and she knew it. The boy sat down slowly this time, not because he was told to, but because the moment no longer required him to stand. The shift had happened. His classmates were grappling with something deeper than a lesson plan. They were confronting the realization that racism did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived as an assumption they never bothered to question. The bell rang, sharp and sudden, but no one moved. The sound felt intrusive, out of sync with the gravity of what had just occurred. Students gathered their things slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure how to transition back into routine after seeing behind the curtain. A few glanced at the boy as they passed, not with curiosity now but with something closer to respect or regret. The teacher moved quickly to her desk, her motions brisk, controlled. She picked up the phone, turning slightly away from the class. The boy watched her out of the corner of his eye, a familiar tension settling back into his chest. He knew that moments like this rarely ended cleanly. Institutions had ways of protecting themselves when narratives broke down. As students filtered out into the hallway, whispers followed, not mocking, not amused, but unsettled. The classroom emptied, leaving behind the decorations, the erased board, the echo of a truth that could not be neatly packed away. The boy slung his backpack over his shoulder, unsure of what waited beyond the door, but certain of one thing: this had gone beyond him now. Behind him, the teacher's voice dropped into a low, urgent tone as she spoke into the phone, choosing her words carefully. The administration had been alerted. The hallway aftermath. No one prepared him for. The hallway hit him all at once. The moment he stepped outside the classroom, the controlled quiet of desks and rules dissolved into motion. Lockers slamming, shoes squeaking, voices overlapping in ways that felt suddenly sharper than usual. It should have been familiar. He had walked these halls every day for years, but now, the space felt altered, as if the walls themselves had shifted slightly, widening the distance between him and everyone else. He felt it immediately, the subtle recalibration of social gravity. Whispers followed him before he heard them clearly. They traveled in fragments, unfinished sentences, and half-formed reactions that curled around his back like smoke. Some were hurried, some hushed, some not even meant to be quiet. He did not need to catch every word to understand their tone. Curiosity, discomfort, admiration, resentment. The hallway had become an echo chamber, and he was its unintentional center. Students who usually passed him without notice now looked twice. A few stared openly, eyes searching his face as if expecting it to explain something they could not yet articulate. Others avoided him entirely, turning shoulders, pretending to check phones, suddenly absorbed by locker combinations they had memorized years ago. He noticed how quickly people chose sides without ever naming them. Attention, he realized, was power, but it came with exposure. A boy he had known since elementary school slowed beside him, opening his mouth as if to speak, then closing it again. The moment stretched, awkward and fragile. Finally, the boy muttered, "That was intense," before drifting away, relief evident in his retreat. The exchange left a hollow feeling behind, not because it was unkind, but because it was unfinished. Everyone seemed unsure what language to use now that the script had been disrupted. He kept walking, his backpack heavier than it had been minutes earlier. Each step felt deliberate, measured. He was acutely aware of how his posture might be read, too confident, too defiant, too emotional. He adjusted without thinking, years of self-monitoring rising automatically. Speaking up had changed the equation, but it had not erased the rules. It had rewritten them. Near the water fountain, a group of students fell silent as he approached. Their conversation had clearly been about him. He could tell by the way their eyes flicked away, by the tension that snapped into place when he passed. One girl looked genuinely conflicted, her expression caught between guilt and admiration. Another's face hardened, her jaw set in something like annoyance. He realized then that not everyone welcomed disruption. For some, the classroom had been comfortable, exactly as it was. An unexpected moment came when a student he barely knew stepped into his path. Not confrontationally, but hesitantly. "I didn't know," she said, her voice low, almost apologetic. "About all of that." She gestured vaguely, unable to find words that wouldn't betray how little she had considered before now. He nodded once. He did not reassure her. He did not absolve her. He simply acknowledged the statement, and continued walking. He understood that awareness was not the same as accountability. Still, the exchange lingered with him, a reminder that even small shifts in understanding could ripple outward. The hallway noise swelled again, but it felt different now, charged, uneven. Some students seemed energized by the disruption, talking animatedly, replaying the scene in exaggerated fragments. Others grew quieter, retreating into themselves, unsettled by the realization that school was not as neutral as they had believed. The boy felt suspended between these reactions, neither celebrated nor condemned outright, but undeniably changed. As he approached his locker, he noticed a teacher down the hall watching him closely. The gaze was not hostile, but it was assessing, the look of someone already calculating implications. He felt a familiar unease settle in his stomach. Moments like this rarely ended with simple understanding. Systems did not like unpredictability, especially when it came from those they were used to managing quietly. He opened his locker and stared at its contents without really seeing them. His hands moved on autopilot, swapping books, adjusting straps. Inside, his thoughts raced. Had he said too much? Had he not said enough? He replayed the teacher's interruption, the crack in her voice, the way authority had stiffened instead of softened. He knew better than to expect resolution. More often than not, speaking truth triggered procedures. The bell rang again, signaling the next period, but he lingered for a moment longer. He felt exposed in a way he had never experienced before. Not unsafe exactly, but unshielded. Silence had once been armor. Now without it, he felt every glance more sharply. He wondered if this was what visibility always cost. Down the hall, the classroom door he had just left opened. The teacher stepped out briefly, her face set, professionalism carefully arranged like a mask. She did not look at him. Instead, she walked briskly toward the main office, heels clicking with purpose. The boy watched her go, a knot forming in his chest. He recognized that walk. It was not reflective. It was procedural. Students began to move past him again, urgency returning as schedules reclaimed attention. But the whispers did not fully fade. They followed him as he headed toward his next class, quieter now, but still present. He felt the social balance recalibrating with every step. Speaking up had shifted power in ways that were not immediately visible, not always loud, but unmistakable. As he turned the corner, out of sight of the classroom, He caught one last glimpse of the teacher through the glass of the office door. She was already speaking to someone inside, gesturing with controlled emphasis, her expression composed but tight. He did not need to hear the words to understand their purpose. Back in the classroom she had left behind, the computer screen glowed quietly. A form was being opened. The incident was being documented. A mother walks into the school, carrying generations of restraint. The call reached her while she was at work, the phone vibrating against a counter worn smooth by years of repetition. She listened without interrupting, her face composed in the way it had learned to be long ago. The voice on the other end used careful language, measured, procedural, stripped of emotion, but she heard what lived beneath it. There had been an incident. Her son had spoken out of turn. A classroom discussion had escalated. Words like concern and disruption floated in the air, never quite landing where they belonged. By the time the call ended, she already knew she would be coming in, not as a parent reacting, but as someone stepping into a familiar role she had hoped her son might never need to see. When she arrived at the school, she did not rush. She walked through the front doors with a posture shaped by history, shoulders squared, expression calm, every movement deliberate. The office smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, a scent she associated with authority and containment. The receptionist looked up, startled for just a moment, before settling into politeness. Names were exchanged, identification was requested, and provided. The rituals of entry unfolded smoothly, but beneath them ran a current of recognition. This was not her first time navigating an institution that framed harm as inconvenience. Her son waited nearby, seated alone, his backpack at his feet. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. Relief, pride, worry, all layered together. She did not embrace him immediately. She knew how quickly gestures could be misread. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder. Grounding, steady. "I'm here," she said quietly. It was not reassurance. It was confirmation. They were led into a conference room that felt intentionally neutral. Plain walls, round table, chairs arranged to suggest equality. The teacher sat on one side, posture rigid, a folder placed neatly in front of her. An administrator joined them moments later, offering a practiced smile that did not quite reach his eyes. The mother took her seat without hesitation, folding her hands in her lap, her presence calm but unmistakably weighted. The administrator began, framing the meeting as an opportunity for clarification. He spoke of classroom dynamics, of maintaining order, of ensuring discussions remained appropriate. The language was smooth, institutional, designed to flatten complexity. The teacher added her account, emphasizing how the lesson had been disrupted, how boundaries had been crossed. She spoke with restraint now, careful to sound reasonable, to position herself as a professional managing an unexpected challenge. The mother listened without interruption. Her face remained composed, but inside, memories stirred. Classrooms she had sat in decades earlier, meetings where tone mattered more than truth, where restraint was mistaken for agreement. She had learned young that survival often required silence, but she had also learned when silence became complicity. When the teacher finished, the room waited, expecting reaction. She did not raise her voice when she spoke. She did not accuse. She contextualized. "My son didn't interrupt a lesson," she said evenly. "He corrected a narrative." The administrator shifted slightly in his chair. She continued, explaining how assumptions about black families were not harmless, how they echoed histories of erasure that schools had long participated in. She spoke of patterns, not personalities, of impact, not intent. She described her family's Christmas traditions, not as defense, but as evidence that the lesson had failed before it began. She explained how black families had always celebrated, created joy, preserved faith, even when institutions refused to recognize it. Her words carried the weight of generations, of stories passed down quietly because they were never asked for loudly. The room grew still, not uncomfortable yet, but alert. The administrator nodded occasionally, signaling understanding without committing to it. He thanked her for sharing, praised her composure. Then he shifted the focus. He spoke of policy, of protocol, of the importance of maintaining a respectful learning environment. He suggested that while the topic was sensitive, the manner in which it had been addressed could be reviewed. The subtle reframing was familiar, harm recast as miscommunication, power imbalance softened into procedural concern. The mother felt the shift immediately. This was the pivot. Accountability was being replaced with management. She leaned forward slightly, her voice still calm. Respectful environments don't require children to swallow misinformation, she said. They require adults to question their assumption. The teacher stiffened. I never intended, she began. But the mother did not let the sentence finish the way it wanted to. Intent doesn't undo impact, she said gently. And impact doesn't disappear because it's inconvenient. An unexpected tension filled the room. The administrator glanced at the clock, then back at his notes. He began outlining next steps: documentation, review, training considerations. The language grew vaguer, the solutions less specific. The mother recognized the pattern. Institutions did not deny harm outright. They diluted it. They spread it thin until it lost its shape. She felt a familiar ache settle in her chest. Not anger, but exhaustion. She had walked into rooms like this, her entire life, carrying explanations others never had to offer. She looked at her son, saw the clarity in his eyes, the steadiness he had found earlier that day. She understood that whatever decision was made here would not erase what had already happened, but it would signal what the school valued more: truth or comfort. The administrator finally concluded, summarizing the meeting, in terms that felt sanitized. He assured them the matter would be handled internally, that the school took concerns seriously, that all parties would be reminded of expectations. The mother heard what he did not say. There would be no acknowledgement of harm, no apology, no admission that the lesson itself had been flawed. As they stood to leave, the teacher gathered her folder, her expression carefully neutral. The administrator extended his hand, offering thanks again. The mother accepted it briefly, her grip firm but restrained. She had not come to win. She had come to be heard, and she knew now that the institution had already chosen its posture. In the hallway outside, she placed her hand on her son's back once more. You did nothing wrong, she said quietly. He nodded, understanding more than he should have had to. Behind them, the conference room door closed softly. Inside, decisions were being framed, language being adjusted, responsibility being redirected. The school, true to form, had chosen self-protection over accountability. When institutional language tries to bury harm, the school's response arrived the way it always did: quietly, efficiently, wrapped in language that sounded reasonable enough to discourage resistance. It began with an email sent to parents before most of them had even heard what happened. The subject line was neutral, almost reassuring, promising transparency while delivering distance. Words like incident, misunderstanding, and learning opportunity appeared early and often, carefully arranged to dull the edges of what had occurred. Nowhere did the message name the harm. Nowhere did it acknowledge who had been harmed. It spoke instead about maintaining a positive environment, about values, about moving forward. The boy read the email over his mother's shoulder that evening, recognizing the pattern before he finished the first paragraph. The tone was familiar, softened, diluted, stripped of accountability. It read as though the school were narrating a weather event, rather than a moment of bias. Something unfortunate but impersonal, something that had simply happened. His name was not mentioned. The teacher's name was not mentioned. Responsibility hovered abstractly, never landing. Policies followed. Attachments were included, dense and formal, outlining procedures for classroom discussions, guidelines for cultural sensitivity, steps for addressing concerns. They were written in a language that felt intentionally inaccessible, designed less to clarify than to contain. The boy noticed how the policies emphasized decorum and respect without once addressing power, without once questioning who decided what was appropriate to discuss and who bore the consequences when assumptions were taught as fact. In staff meetings behind closed doors, the narrative continued to shift. The teacher's actions were framed as well-intentioned, her interruption as classroom management, the boy's speech as emotional but disruptive. The institution spoke fluently, in euphemism. Harm became discomfort. Racism became miscommunication. Accountability became training. The school was not denying what happened. It was absorbing it, neutralizing it, filing it away until it no longer posed a threat. The boy felt the effects immediately. Teachers spoke to him more carefully now, their voices gentle in a way that felt performative. Some avoided the topic entirely, as if silence could restore balance. Others offered vague encouragement, praising his courage, without acknowledging the cost. He sensed that he had been categorized, no longer just a student, but a situation. His presence carried context now, and context made people nervous. His classmates received the message too, though differently. Some repeated the school's language verbatim, using words they had learned were safe. It was a misunderstanding, one said, shrugging, eager to close the door on discomfort. Others hesitated, torn between what they had felt in the room and what the institution had told them to believe afterward. The gap between lived experience and official narrative widened, leaving confusion in its wake. At home, his mother read every word carefully, her expression steady but tired. She recognized the strategy instantly. Institutions did not confront racism. They reframed it until it became administrative noise. She explained this to her son gently, not to discourage him but to prepare him. They're trying to make it smaller, she said, because smaller things are easier to ignore. The boy nodded, understanding settling into something heavier than disappointment. He realized that the system was not broken in the way people often claimed. It was functioning exactly as designed to protect itself first. The clarity did not crush him, but it did change him. He began to see how language could be weaponized quietly, how harm could be buried beneath professionalism. Another email arrived days later, this one addressed directly to students. It spoke of unity, of shared values, of respect for diverse perspectives. It encouraged reflection without inviting dialogue. It urged kindness without naming injustice. The boy read it twice, noticing how expertly it sidestepped the truth. The speech that had shifted a room was reduced to an unnamed moment, stripped of its context and its power. An unexpected turn came not from the school, but from the margins. A classmate reached out privately, hesitantly, asking if the boy had written down what he said. Another admitted they had recorded part of it on their phone, not to expose him, but because it had felt important. The boy felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Possibility. He had not planned for witnesses beyond that room. He had not imagined his words traveling further. The institution continued its efforts. Meetings were scheduled. Language was refined. The teacher remained in place, her conduct deemed appropriate within policy. The school presented itself as responsive while changing nothing that mattered. The boy watched it happen, with a growing awareness that the truth did not disappear just because it was inconvenient. It lingered, waiting for air. Late one night, as he sat at the kitchen table finishing homework, his phone vibrated. A message appeared from a number he did not recognize. Attached was a short video clip, grainy, unpolished, unmistakable. His voice filled the screen, steady and clear, speaking words he remembered saying but had not realized, carried beyond the room. The angle suggested it had been recorded discreetly, carefully, as if the person behind the camera knew its value even then. He watched it once, then again, his heart pounding. The clip ended abruptly, mid-sentence, but it was enough. Enough to show the truth the emails had buried. Enough to challenge the narrative the institution had constructed. Another notification followed, then another. Messages multiplied, each carrying a variation of the same realization. The speech was moving. Outside the school's carefully managed channels, beyond its polished language and procedural walls, the truth was finding its own path. The boy stared at the screen, a mix of fear and resolve settling in his chest. The institution had tried to bury harm with words, but words, he was learning, could also resurrect it. Somewhere beyond the walls of the school, the boy's speech had begun circulating online. The internet reacts while the school panics. By morning, the video was no longer just a clip passed quietly between classmates. It had escaped the careful boundaries the school relied on to manage narratives. Someone had uploaded it to a public platform with a caption that asked a simple question, one the institution had avoided entirely. Within hours, the question had multiplied into thousands of comments, reposts, and stitched reactions. The boy woke to a phone that would not stop vibrating, each notification a reminder that what had once felt isolated was now shared, interpreted, and argued over by strangers. The video spread not because it was polished, but because it was unmistakably real. The framing was imperfect, the sound uneven, but the truth carried cleanly. Viewers heard a black boy speak about faith and family without defensiveness, about dignity without bitterness. They heard the interruption too, the moment authority cut him off. That contrast became the fault line along which the internet fractured. Some viewers focused on his words, others focused on the power dynamic. Very few could look away. Comment sections filled with recognition and resistance, in equal measure. Black parents shared stories of similar moments their children had endured, naming the exhaustion of having to explain humanity in spaces that claimed neutrality. Teachers chimed in, some in solidarity, others in defense of professionalism, insisting intent mattered more than impact. The debate widened quickly, spilling into morning talk shows and opinion columns. The boy's face appeared on screens far beyond his city, frozen mid-sentence, labeled by headlines that tried and failed to simplify what he had said. At school, panic moved faster than reflection. Administrators convened emergency meetings, their language shifting again, urgency replacing confidence. Emails were drafted and redrafted. Legal counsel consulted. Public relations strategies debated. The institution that had once moved slowly now scrambled to keep pace with a narrative it no longer controlled. The carefully neutral language from earlier communications felt inadequate against the raw clarity of the video. Teachers were instructed not to comment. Students were warned against filming in class. The policy suddenly emphasized with new severity. The boy noticed how quickly the focus turned from the harm described to the method by which it had been revealed. Procedure became the shield. Accountability remained elusive. At home, his mother watched the coverage unfold with a steady gaze. She did not celebrate the attention. She understood its volatility. Visibility could amplify truth, but it could also invite distortion. She coached him through the noise, reminding him to rest, to breathe, to let others carry the argument now. "You already said what needed to be said," she told him. "You don't owe the world anything else." But the world kept asking. Journalists requested interviews. Advocacy groups reached out with messages of support. Critics accused him of disrespect, of misunderstanding education, of stirring division. The boy felt the strain of being discussed more than listened to, his words dissected by people who had not been in the room. He recognized the pattern again, how easily narratives drifted away from lived experience once institutions and audiences got involved. Inside the school, fear reshaped behavior. Hallways felt tighter, conversations quieter. Some teachers avoided him entirely, uncertain how to engage without stepping into controversy. Others offered private words of support, careful to keep them off the record. Students whispered less now, not out of resolution, but caution. Everyone sensed that consequences were coming, though no one knew where they would land. An unexpected turn arrived when a prominent educator shared the video publicly, framing it not as an isolated incident, but as a case study in how culture was defined and misdefined in classrooms across the country. The post went viral within hours, reframing the conversation from discipline to belonging. Suddenly, the school's earlier emails looked evasive. The narrative shifted again, this time towards systemic critique. Under mounting pressure, the district released a new statement. This one acknowledged the harm more directly, though still carefully. It promised review, reflection, and action. The language edged closer to responsibility without fully embracing it. Still, the shift was noticeable. The institution was responding now, not just to parents but to the public. The boy learned about the decision, late in the afternoon, through a message that arrived without ceremony. The teacher had been placed on administrative leave, pending review. The wording was precise, legal, non-committal. It did not admit wrongdoing. It did not apologize. But it marked a change the school could no longer avoid. He sat quietly, the weight of the moment settling in. There was no triumph in it, only a deep, complicated stillness. He understood that this was not an ending, but a pause, a moment where power recalibrated under scrutiny. The conversation he had started had grown beyond him, beyond the classroom, into a national reckoning about who was allowed to define culture, faith, and belonging. Outside, winter light faded early, the sky dimming as if to mirror the uncertainty ahead. The boy looked at his phone one more time, watching the video play silently on repeat. He knew that whatever came next for him, for the school, for the story would be shaped by forces far larger than a single classroom. And somewhere behind closed doors, decisions were still being made, consequences still unfolding, even as one truth had finally broken through. The teacher was on leave. The room had changed, and nothing felt settled yet. The day the boy returns to school changed forever. The morning he returned to school, the building looked the same, but it no longer felt neutral. The brick walls, the flag at the entrance, the glass doors that reflected the winter sky, all of it carried a new weight. He paused for a moment before stepping inside, adjusting the strap of his backpack, steadying his breath. This place had once been a background in his life, a space he moved through quietly. Now it felt like a stage he had never auditioned for, one he could not step off. The hallway reacted before he did. Conversations thinned as he passed. Not abruptly, but noticeably, like a radio dial being turned down. Some students smiled at him, with a kind of admiration that felt tentative. unsure of its boundaries. Others looked away too quickly, discomfort written across their faces. He recognized both responses as symptoms of the same truth. Invisibility had been replaced with recognition, and recognition came with friction. A girl he barely knew stopped him near the lockers. "I saw the video," she said softly, as if sharing a confession. "I didn't know. I mean, thank you." The gratitude sat awkwardly between them, heavy with things left unsaid. He nodded, accepting it without ceremony. He had learned quickly that appreciation could coexist with distance. People wanted to acknowledge him without being implicated. As he moved through the building, teachers' reactions varied. One offered a warm smile, genuine and unguarded, a quiet nod that felt like solidarity. Another stiffened, eyes sliding past him as if avoiding contact might preserve neutrality. He noticed how adults now weighed every interaction, aware that words carried consequences. The irony was not lost on him. This caution had not existed when assumptions were spoken freely. In his first class, the seat he had always occupied felt suddenly conspicuous. He sat down carefully, aware of eyes on him, of whispers he could not fully hear. The lesson began, but attention drifted. He sensed that for many, learning had become secondary to observation. He was no longer just a student. He was a symbol, a reminder, a question mark. The realization tightened something in his chest. Truth, once spoken, did not fade politely into the background. An unexpected tension surfaced when a student who had mocked him weeks earlier approached during a break. The apology was awkward, rushed, layered with defensiveness. "I didn't mean it like that," the student said, avoiding eye contact. The boy listened without interrupting, then responded simply, "Impact still counts." The exchange ended there, unresolved but honest. He understood that some people wanted absolution more than accountability. By lunchtime, the cafeteria buzzed with a low hum of attention. He chose a table near the window, as he always had, but the space around him filled quickly. Some classmates joined him deliberately, signaling support. Others hovered nearby, curious but uncertain. He felt both surrounded and alone, caught between connection and scrutiny. Admiration warmed him briefly. Resentment lingered longer, unspoken but present in glances and posture. He thought about how easily the narrative could shift again. Today's courage could become tomorrow's inconvenience. Institutions had long memories for disruption. He felt the cost of truth settling into his routine. Extra attention, altered expectations, the pressure to be consistent, articulate, unflinching. There was no return to quiet anonymity. He wondered if the trade had been worth it, then remembered the classroom, the lie spoken as fact, and knew the answer had never really been a choice. In the afternoon, an announcement crackled over the intercom, carefully worded, reminding students of conduct expectations and respect. No names were mentioned, no specifics offered. The boy recognized the tone. Measured, protective, non-committal. It confirmed what he already suspected. The institution was still negotiating how to respond without conceding too much. The balance between appearance and accountability remained delicate. As the final bell approached, a counselor asked to speak with him briefly. The conversation was polite, supportive on the surface, but cautious beneath. Resources were mentioned. Safety was emphasized. He listened, nodding, aware that concern could be genuine and strategic at the same time. He left the office with a pamphlet in his bag, and a familiar sense that systems preferred management over change. Walking out of the building that afternoon, he felt the day's weight settle into his shoulders. The air was cold, the sky pale, the season pressing forward regardless of human conflict. He paused again at the doors, looking back once more. The school had changed him, but he had changed it too, if only by forcing it to look at itself. His phone buzzed as he stepped outside. A message from his mother, brief and steady. They scheduled the meeting. He read it twice, understanding the significance immediately. This was not a conversation. It was a culmination. Decisions would be formalized. Language would be finalized. Power would assert itself one way or another. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and started down the steps, the building receding behind him. The truth had altered the landscape, but the outcome remained uncertain. Somewhere beyond the walls he had just left, the school board was preparing to meet, preparing to decide what would stand, what would be acknowledged, and what would be quietly preserved. The final meeting had been scheduled. A Christmas lesson, no textbook ever taught. The school board meeting did not look the way people imagined justice would. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confessions, No moment where the truth landed with the force of consequence. Instead, there were long tables, name placards, measured tones, and language that moved carefully around the center of the issue, without ever standing inside it. The boy sat beside his mother, feet planted firmly on the floor, hands folded, listening as adults spoke about him without truly speaking to him. His story had become an agenda item, time-bound and framed, something to be resolved before moving on. The board acknowledged concerns. They praised dialogue. They emphasized growth. Words like learning curve and moving forward together floated across the room, polished and rehearsed. The teacher's absence was noted only indirectly, referenced through policy rather than accountability. No one said her name. No one repeated the sentence that had started everything. The lie was not corrected aloud. It was quietly retired, as if silence could undo its reach. His mother spoke when invited, her voice calm, unwavering. She did not demand punishment. She asked for recognition. She asked for accuracy. She asked that Black families not be treated as theoretical subjects but as lived realities. Her words carried weight, but the room absorbed them carefully, filtering impact through procedure. When she finished, there was polite applause, respectful, contained, insufficient. The boy listened as the final decision was summarized. Additional training would be implemented. Curriculum would be reviewed. The matter would be considered addressed. It sounded complete, official, resolved, and yet nothing about it felt finished. The institution had protected itself again, offering gestures instead of reckoning. The cost of truth, he realized, was rarely paid by systems. It was paid by people. Outside the meeting room, winter had settled fully. Holiday lights glowed along the street, festive and detached from the gravity that had just passed. The boy watched families walk by, bundled together, laughter trailing behind them. Christmas was arriving, unchanged by board meetings or policy reviews. Life moved forward whether justice kept pace or not. At home, the quiet returned slowly. Decorations sat in familiar places. Music played softly. Dinner unfolded with the same rituals his family had always honored. Nothing about their celebration had changed. And yet everything. He understood now how invisible their joy had been to others, how easily erased by assumption. He also understood the power of naming it aloud. Later that night, he sat alone, scrolling through messages he had not yet answered. Support, criticism, gratitude, anger, all mingled together, proof that his words had traveled far beyond intention. He felt pride and fatigue in equal measure. Speaking had not been a moment. It had been a door. Once opened, it did not close. His mother sat beside him quietly. "You did what you could," she said, "not as consolation, but as truth. The rest isn't yours to carry." He nodded, though he knew some part of it always would be. Stories did not end when institutions finished talking about them. They lingered, waiting to be told again, told better, told louder if necessary. He thought back to the classroom, to the moment his hand rose against instinct, against history. That single gesture had disrupted something old, not destroyed it, but cracked it. As Christmas morning approached, he felt a strange clarity settle in. The lesson had never been about a holiday. It had been about belonging, about who was allowed to define reality, and who was expected to accept distortion quietly. No textbook had taught him how to navigate that. No curriculum had prepared him for the cost of truth. Standing by the window, watching lights flicker against the dark, he understood something else too. His story had not ended with the board's decision. It had not ended with the video or the headlines, or the meeting. It had begun the moment he refused to let a lie stand uncontested. Somewhere beyond this winter, beyond this school, beyond this single Christmas, there would be other rooms, other assumptions, other moments that demanded courage. He did not know what shape they would take yet, but he knew now that silence was no longer his inheritance. The lie had been disrupted. The lesson had been learned, and the boy realized his story was only beginning. If this story moved something inside you, don't let it end in silence. Type yes in the comments if you believe truth should never be punished for making people uncomfortable. And tell us, what would you have done in that classroom? Subscribe to stay with these stories, because they aren't just entertainment, they're reminders. As long as injustice exists, these voices deserve to be heard, and this space will keep making room for them.